Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeff Meisner. I'm the Senior Developer Marketing Manager here at Avalara. Thank you to everyone who has dialed in to attend our Supply Chain Exemption Management and Use Tax Automation webinar. In the room this morning, in addition to myself, is Mark Wilhelm, who is the Director of the Partner Launch Team, as well as Stefan Kim, who is a member of the Partner Launch Team as well. Mark will be leading the discussion this morning. Please do feel free to ask questions as the discussion goes on. We will also reserve about 10 or 15 minutes at the top of the hour to, the bottom of the hour to field any final questions from the attendees, and I will now turn it over to Mark. Mark.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. And as Jeff indicated, it's Mark Wilhelm, part of the Partner Launch Team, and our team is part of the greater Partner Management Group here at Avalara. My team, along with Stefan and others, work with our partners as they're going through design, development, certification, and launching of new integrations using Avalara technologies. We also work with our partners as they circle back and wish to enhance with additional features and functions, maybe one of them being what we talk about today around supply chain management, exemption management, use tax automation. And we work with them as well as with other enhancements that are rolling out through the Avalara services. With that said, though, today we're going to talk about the supply chain component, and it's oftentimes a component that is not considered in most integrations from a tax compliance perspective. So what we're going to do today is go through and cover a little bit of the compliance elements as you're dealing with supply chain, procuring goods, paying for goods, and then making sure you have compliant taxation of those goods or the compliant exemption from taxation of sold goods. I've dropped up here our safe harbor, and basically the document and what we'll be talking about today is our Avalara's intentions, and many of these already in place, but anything that we talk about is future. Our intentions as of July 2019, and if you see the rest of the verbiage, we reserve the right to change any functionality release dates for any future-facing functionality. Today, we'll talk a little bit and start off with just an overview of the supply chain tax compliance automation and how that fits in. We'll look at different purchasing scenarios where either exemption automation or use tax automation comes in those. Those scenarios are going to be primarily, in many cases, when you're onboarding new suppliers, when you're onboarding new buyers, and then dealing with the exemption management of any seller or buyer that is claiming an exemption, and then managing the consumer use tax component at the back end once you procure goods and making sure that you, just to determine if you have any need to self-assess a use tax. And this is a graphic that we use. We used it started using it at Crush, our annual conference that was held in Huntington Beach this past May. And essentially, you'll see here, there is the supplier management up at the middle of the grid, and it is a component of omni-channel selling, and many times an often forgotten component of an omni-channel marketplace or omni-channel selling environment, and it's really driving the introduction of goods and services into the channel so that they can potentially be subsequently sold or consumed by the seller as part of the selling process. And a little bit about supply chain and tax compliance, and keep in mind that many times when you're hearing information from Avalara or other tax automation groups, the component that you're typically seeing is on the selling side. When I'm selling a product, when I'm selling a service, making sure as the seller that I am appropriately charging tax where I'm compelled to or required to based upon the taxing authority, and then making sure that that tax is calculated accurately, and then subsequently filed and remitted with the appropriate taxing authority. In today's session, we're going to turn that pretty much, take a look at it from a 100-degree angle and going from the other way, which is looking at what happens when I'm the buyer and what are my requirements when I'm the buyer. And there's also going to be a component that still rests within the seller. Sales tax, as it says up at the top, is in most taxing authorities, if you look at the way that the legislation, ordinance, or statute is written, the sales tax is ultimately the buyer's responsibility, and ultimately it is up to the buyer to determine that they have successfully paid the appropriate sales and transaction taxes on their purchase. So we're going to take a look at it when I'm making a purchase. How do I ensure that I am compliant and I have, if the tax is due, I have paid the tax either to the seller or, as you see as we go through today's session, how to self-assess what is known as use tax or consumer use tax so that I can self-report that. There is some component on exemption certificate management that remains the seller's responsibility. And from an exemption certificate perspective, if you think about it, if I'm a seller and I am selling a good to the end buyer, that is typically going to be a taxable transaction, or there is a good chance that transaction taxes will be due. The seller many times will charge that based upon where they're required to collect, where they have nexus. But the other component that is required from the exemption certificate side and is the seller's responsibility is that if there is a buyer that claims to be exempt from tax on their purchase for whatever reason, they have a requirement to produce what is typically known as an exemption certificate, a document that will identify the reason for which they are claiming to be exempt from being charged tax. The seller, it is the seller's responsibility to obtain that document and retain that document for future audit purposes to properly document the exemption of charging sales tax or a transaction tax to the end buyer. And we'll talk a ways through today's session about how the seller can automate that process of getting the exemption certificate from the buyer into the seller's hands so that they have the document and then have the ability to retain that document for audit purposes. The applications that are typically in play in this supply chain scenario are, and I missed one on here actually, but there is, if you think about from my ERP, my Enterprise Resource Planning or accounting solution, I have an accounts payable module. That's where I'm going to be receiving a seller's or supplier's invoice and processing that for payment. And that is one of the times where I'm going to be needing to assess, am I paying, if I'm supposed to be paying tax, am I paying the right tax? There's also a component in the ERP or the accounting solution, which is the procurement or the purchasing module. And that's many times where I'm making the initial generation of the purchase order to show the buyer the total amount of the order that I'm processing for them. And one of the elements that you may wish to include in there, and many times very beneficial to the buyer, is to put in an estimated sales tax to show this is the amount of tax that is going to come across on this purchase. And so there is that component there where you may want to estimate a tax on a purchase order. And we have the capability to do that, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. There's also the advent of accounts payable automation solutions. There are a variety of those out in the market. They're typically add-ons to your ERP or accounting solution. And what the accounts payable automation solution does is allows you to automate the receipt of an invoice from your supplier and then automating the processing and payment of that. And as part of that, the use tax component or the consumer use tax component is going to come into play. And then finally, a procurement automation solution, and that is a more comprehensive solution that is marrying together procurement solutions and advanced procurement options, as well as accounts payable automation options to further automate that whole supply chain management solution. And there are touch points within a procurement automation solution, much like they would be in an accounts payable automation solution, for automating either exemption certificate management or the consumer use tax component. And then, as I've been mentioning, the reason why you want compliance automation is you want to be able to properly assess use tax if it is due and accrue that use tax so that I have a value that I know that I have to then file and remit with the taxing authority from a buyer's perspective. And then I also have the component of exemption certificate generation, generating the exemption certificate from the buyer, sending it to the seller, and then the seller being able to store and also keep ensuring that if there is a renewal or an update or a refresh of that certificate, being able to manage that through automation. So we'll start with purchase scenarios, and we run into two primary areas here. We're going to talk about validating the amount of sales tax that was charged by my supplier, and we're also then going to talk about what do I do if I have been undercharged sales tax from the buyer's perspective from the supplier. We'll start first with validating the sales tax charged by the supplier. And essentially, all three of those solutions, actually all four of those solutions that we mentioned earlier, are applicable for this role. And where you typically see this is during the supplier invoice processing. So I have received an invoice, I'm the buyer. I've received an invoice from our supplier, and I am now processing it through either my accounts payable module, my accounts payable automation module, or my procurement automation. And as I'm processing that, I want to be able to evaluate and see, is the sales tax that was charged on this invoice the accurate amount of tax? And you have the ability through the Avalara service to call our service, provide us information about what that purchase is comprised of. And that is whatever products that might be sold, whatever services that were sold. Maybe there was a product with a shipping charge, breaking out that shipping charge, and then breaking out the amount of sales tax. And then calling the Avalara service with the components of, here are the components of the purchase I'm making, the types of products, where I'm taking ownership of that product, or potentially where I am consuming that product. And then having Avalara and the Avatax service return an estimated sales tax based upon that information on your purchase, and allowing you to compare that with what the supplier charged. And with the results of that, and you typically are seeing that done real time, I'm processing an invoice, I have the application call the Avatax service, come back with an estimated sales tax that should be due, and then have a screen where I'm providing a review and saying, here's what the supplier charged me as far as tax, and here's what the compliant tax amount should be. And that gives you the ability to, at that time, review the results, and then it is a decision point to either approve the supplier invoice for payment, meaning that I was accurately charged tax and I want to now approve that, or I may reject, as another extreme, reject that invoice and send it back. I could do that because perhaps maybe the supplier charged me tax and they should not be charging me tax. I should be exempt, or I consider that an exempt item. And in that scenario, I may return the invoice with a request for the supplier to correct that, or I may just deduct that amount and process it with the sales tax charged by the supplier deducted from my payment. So a couple areas there, and we'll go into more detail about what are the APIs that would be leveraged to make those calls and the way that you'll get that information back. The next area is really talking about once I do get that Avatax amount back, and Avatax says that the tax amount should have been, perhaps it was a 10% tax rate, and I was only charged 8%. In this case, that is that's the lower of the bullet points there. Supplier charges tax on invoice but undercharges. In that scenario, I may want to take the amount and an amount that I consider a material amount of undercharged tax and self-accrue that and identify that tax amount, that difference between what the supplier charged and what Avatax came back and said is the correct amount, accrue that, record that as a liability in my general ledger, and then keep that as an open liability that I will then remit the taxes and file them with the appropriate taxing authority. The key thing here, and much like the next scenario that we'll talk about when the supplier didn't charge me tax on a taxable purchase, but the key component here is any use tax accrual is not a tax and not an amount that I will include in my payment back to the supplier. It is an amount that I'm going to self-assess, accrue, and record in my general ledger as an open liability. And in the scenario, a simpler scenario is the supplier didn't charge me tax. That's a very common scenario if the supplier may not have any requirement to collect. For example, I might be an organization based in Nevada. I make a purchase from a supplier in New York. That supplier doesn't have a physical presence or any economic nexus requirements to collect tax in Nevada, and accordingly is going to send me an invoice with zero tax. If that truly should be a taxable purchase for the buyer, this is the time to have the Avatax solution self-assess, take the information on that supplier's invoice, determine the tax, determine where that purchase was either shipped to or consumed at, and calculate the use tax that is due. I can do that dynamically through a integration with Avatax and call the service to get that. I can also have a second scenario where I can queue that and have an end of month report run that shows all of the invoices perhaps that came in without tax that should have been taxed, and then through a batch import, push that into the Avatax service to get an end of month asynchronous process to assess my use tax. And we'll talk about both of those methods. And with that, we're about 20 minutes in. Jeff, do we have any questions coming in? I haven't checked.
We do not at this point. Okay. Folks, do please surface your questions because Mark and Stefan are experts in this stuff, and this is your chance to get one-to-one FaceTime with them and get your questions answered.
So we talked in the first purchase scenario around what do I specifically do about tax when I have tax coming in on a supplier's invoice and I want to validate that or self-assess, and also then accrue that from a use tax perspective. There's also a purchase scenario where I'm dealing with a buyer that is claiming an exemption, and a variety of reasons why a buyer might claim an exemption. Probably one of the most common is the buyer is a reseller of the seller's product. So I might be a manufacturer of electronics and I sell monitors, I might sell televisions, I might sell other types of electronic equipment and manufacture that equipment. And my selling model is I sell that to another organization, maybe a merchant that's going to put it out on the internet on their website for sale to an end consumer. I might be a merchant that's running a store. But nonetheless, if I am a reseller of a particular product, in most states I am considered exempt from sales tax. Sales tax is traditionally only due by the end consumer, the final consumer of the product. And as a reseller of that product, I'm not the end consumer. I am just facilitating the sale to the end consumer from the manufacturer. And in that scenario, I may be exempt, and the way that I prove to the seller so that the seller or the supplier has the ability to legally exempt me from tax is to provide an exemption certificate. So as I'm onboarding new suppliers into my organization and I am asking them to exempt me from tax, this is the perfect time to not only onboard the supplier and get them set up for procurement and payment scenarios through my ERP or my procurement solution, but it's also the best time for me to generate an exemption certificate and get that into the supplier's hands so that my first purchase order and then most importantly, my first invoice from that supplier will be taxed accordingly, or in this case, exempted accordingly. We give the method to get to a exemption certificate and generate one dynamically through a free feature called Avalara Cert Express. And I'm going to actually, I didn't want to do that yet, but I am going to come over here and move to Cert Express, and I'm now just dynamically, if you go out to app.certexpress.com, this is a free service that buyers without this included in the automation cycle in their solution. This is a free service where I, as a buyer, can go out and create an exemption certificate on the fly through Cert Express and electronically forward that on to my supplier or my seller. It's a free service. All you do is come in, sign up, and it will allow you to do that. There's also a way, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, that I can, as the supplier, point my buyers to this as a way to get exemption certificates on the fly. So one of the areas where I want to come in dealing with the Cert Express is I'm onboarding a new supplier. They need, the buyer can then go out to Avalara Cert Express for free, generate the exemption certificate. It will prompt you for where are you consuming the purchase, the state. It will then prompt you to understand what type of exemption are you claiming. Are you a reseller? Or are you maybe an educational organization that is just primarily exempt? But it will then identify the appropriate exemption certificate, allow you to complete it online, electronically sign it, and then deliver that electronically directly to the buyer so they have an electronic image that they can store locally of your exemption certificate, and then you'll be ensured of having that exemption certificate on file and applied during the tax calculation of your invoices. And then we'll reverse that and we'll look at it from the supplier side. And keep in mind, on the supplier or seller side, I have a much more detailed requirement for maintaining exemption certificates, because first of all, I have to have one on file to legally exempt a sale to a buyer from sales tax. However, I also have an ongoing requirement for compliance activities to retain that exemption certificate and produce it whenever the auditor comes in, is looking at my sales, and is wanting to ensure that I see that you sold to company X. You sold to company X and you did not charge them tax in my state. I'll need to see an exemption certificate, and you need to be able to readily produce that certificate to get through the audit. We provide not only the Cert Express to generate the exemption certificate, and that is a free service through Avalara, but there is also a premium service called Cert Capture. And Cert Capture is more designed for the seller, and this allows me that when I'm onboarding a new buyer, I'm in my procurement solution, I'm in my purchasing module, and when I interact on that procurement automation solution, or even in accounts payable, as I'm taking that new, onboarding that new supplier, and I see that from my initial order that came in through my sales team that the buyer is claiming an exemption and may not have produced yet an exemption certificate for me. Through Cert Capture and through my subscription or the seller's subscription to Cert Capture, the supplier can record from its customer record the customer information and feed that into Cert Capture to say, here is a customer that's claiming an exemption. And then I can request Cert Capture to reach out dynamically through email to contact that buyer with a redirect back to Cert Capture, where it will take it through a very similar process as Cert Express that will allow the buyer to identify the state that they're claiming the exemption, or the states. It could be a multi-state exemption. Identify the reason that I'm exempt, and then complete the certificate through Cert Capture, submit it back to the seller. Cert Capture will then notify the buyer, notify the seller that the exemption certificate has been completed. It gives a variety of different review and approval processes, anything from a very detailed approval process that will require an asynchronous approval versus I can set it up to just auto-approve these. Cert Capture will then retain that exemption certificate. If that exemption certificate is one in a state that the exemption certificate has a limited life or expiration date, it will track that for you and then prompt you in advance for any renewals of having a new certificate on file as I get close to its expiration date. And that ensures that I am always in a compliant mode when I'm selling to an exempt buyer. And then if you're using Cert Capture in combination with Avatax to generate sales tax on your seller's invoice or on the invoice to your buyer, Avatax will automatically pick up that exemption certificate that resides within Cert Capture and apply the exemption during the dynamic tax calculation process.
Still no questions. It is a quiet crowd today.
All right. Well, either it's tax compliance and it's not that engaging, or I'm doing a really good job of going through the session here. So I did, onboarding new suppliers. Our scenario, buyer purchases goods for exempt usage. I might be a reseller. There's another one that's very common, and I am purchasing the goods to be consumed during the manufacture of my product. And if you think about my scenario where I am a manufacturer of electronic goods, monitors, televisions, etc. As the manufacturer, the parts that I buy and incorporate into my monitor or my television are typically exempt from sales tax as well, because I'm not the end consumer. I'm taking that, incorporating that into my good to then send on and sell to an end consumer. And so a manufacturer's exemption or industrial exemption will be, in the case of the electronics, it might be a scenario where I am going to go in and indicate that when I am buying any of the electronic components, maybe silicon chips or LED or whatever it might be as a component of that monitor, I'm going to be exempt and need to have an exemption certificate.
Hey, Mark, we have a question.
Excellent.
Okay, this is from John Miller. Thank you for your question, John. And then another one came in. Okay, if a company drop ships for its customers to a different state, does the e-tailer have to provide a cert for that state as well? What if they do not meet the threshold for economic nexus in that other state?
So that's a very good question. And so, first of all, I'll make sure that we're level set on the term economic nexus. In 2018, the Supreme Court had the Wayfair versus South Dakota ruling. And in that, it was indicated that, and it overruled the previous Quill decision, Quill versus North Dakota, where Quill versus North Dakota said that a state or taxing authority to compel a seller to charge tax in their taxing authority within their jurisdictional boundaries, typically a state, it must have physical nexus, or it must have a physical presence of some type, an office, maybe storing inventory, a remote employee. With the Wayfair decision in 2018, that dramatically changed the way that the Supreme Court looked at what drives nexus, or the requirement to compel a seller to collect tax on behalf of the taxing authority. And that became an economic nexus threshold, and looking at the gross sales over a look-back period over 12 months. And if you reach whatever that goal is, and some of those revenue thresholds can be as low as $500,000, but if I reach that nexus level of sales into a particular state, and in my example, I'm a seller in New York, I'm selling into the state of Nevada. If Nevada, and I believe Nevada has an economic nexus rule now, but if I reach that revenue level that indicates economic nexus within the state of Nevada, I'm now compelled to collect. Back to the question at hand, which was, I do not reach that nexus threshold. I'm drop shipping into a state where I have no requirement to collect. Typically in that scenario, I don't have to have any documentation to exempt that. I have not reached the threshold to be compelled to collect tax on behalf of that taxing authority, in this case Nevada, and I'm good. There are scenarios in California where if you are a California business and you're drop shipping on behalf of the true seller into that state, into the state of California, you do have some additional requirements around that. Probably a little more detailed than we can go into at this point, but California does have a specific rule about that. Most of the other states, if you have not reached any physical nexus or any economic nexus thresholds, then you're not compelled to collect.
Okay, two more questions. The next one is from Scott McDonald, and he says, we sell to individuals, but occasionally to people who have tax-exempt status. They want to, quote unquote, send us their certificate as an email attachment. Is there a way to capture that in Cert Capture without involving, didn't freeze.
I might be able to see questions.
Without involving the customer beyond having them send us their cert.
So let me go down.
They also drop ship.
Which was that from Scott?
Yeah, he said, we sell to individuals, but occasionally to people who have tax-exempt status. They want to send us their certificate as an email attachment. Is there a way to capture that in Cert Capture without involving the customer beyond having them send us their cert?
Oh, absolutely. Anytime that you have either an electronic image or a scanned image of a physical hard copy, through Cert Capture, you can push in through a manual method yourself, log into Cert Capture, log into your account, and just capture that certificate and drop it in there. So yes, it does not require the electronic interchange between you and the buyer through Cert Capture. It is there for convenience, and it is. But if you do have a supplier or a buyer that is in good faith sending you an accurate copy, and it is the exemption certificate for that particular taxing authority, absolutely, you can import it in, and then Cert Capture will retain that and act on it accordingly.
Okay, and Scott had a follow-up question. Can the manual certificate addition be done by an API call?
It should be. Stephanie, if you can let's document that one. I'm going to have to double check. I think it can be through an API, but I would need to double check.
Okay. And then Fernand Paleo asks, you mentioned earlier sales tax can be requested for each order as the order is processed real time versus all invoices can be held back to be uploaded to Avatax monthly.
Mm-hmm.
If that's true, what is the advantage to do it monthly rather than in real time?
Very good question. And a lot of it is going to be based upon your accountant's perspective of how they want to manage their compliance activities. The reason that you would do a real-time dynamic tax calculation and validation of what the supplier chose, as well as being able to dynamically accrue the use tax. In that scenario, if I'm doing it dynamically, it's typically because I am dealing with high dollar or high value invoices, and I want to make sure that I am upfront validating the amount of tax that I have been charged, if I should have been charged, or if these are high ticket items and they should be exempt from tax, again, doing that evaluation to show they should be exempt. And the reason is I need to make a decision at the time of accepting the supplier's invoice to determine should I pay the invoice, should I reject the invoice, or is there some type of approval process I have to go through. So it's really more because I'm an accountant or on the accounting team, and I want to do a real-time assessment as I'm processing invoices. We typically see this in lower volume, high value tickets or invoices that are coming in. The reason I would do it asynchronously, and this was a scenario that I had happen all the time, is I was a controller for a division of Emerson Electric, and we would have invoices come in, and one of the things that we purchased pallets. And the pallets, depending on how we use them, could be taxable, or they could be exempted because they were included in our manufacturing process. And in that scenario, I knew I wanted to tell all of my buyers, don't charge me tax on any of the purchases. And there's what's known as a direct pay permit. So I said, I'm going to take liability and responsibility for self-assessing the tax through the direct pay permit. And I wanted all those pallet invoices to roll in. I would flag them as being assessed at the end of the month. And at the end of the month, I would accumulate all of those, have Avatax go through and assess the use tax on them based upon where I consume them and the reason why I was buying them, and do that in one mode as part of my end of month routine to come up with my use tax. And in that case, I didn't need to see it dynamically. I didn't want to slow down my accounts payable staff in processing those invoices. I knew I was going to have use tax, flag them as needing assessment, and then evaluate them at one time at the end of the month. And I can do that in aggregate to take a total look at my use tax liability. So it's really looking at what is the business process flow and what is the business reason that I'm going about and needing to do that assessment.
One other question. This is from Andrew McLaughlin, what is our responsibility as a supplier to ensure the exemption certificates of our customers are valid, i.e. tax ID number is valid?
And it does vary from state to state. There is not a comprehensive repository today that you can go to one place and find everyone's valid state ID or tax ID. As long as you may want to validate, through a state mechanism, through a manual process, that the ID that they gave you is accurate. But quite honestly, if they produce a certificate, they have signed the certificate, and if you notice when they sign the certificate, they are making a commitment to the taxing authority. So again, in my Nevada scenario, or actually I'm going to use Ohio because I'm much more familiar with that, because that's where I was controller. In the state of Ohio, when I was signing an exemption certificate to send off to one of my suppliers to say that I was exempt, in that I am declaring that the business name and the business ID, and by signing it, I am declaring that I am giving a valid certificate to the supplier, and I am assuring them that all the information I've provided on there is accurate. Typically, as long as you have that certificate, you have it completed and all the blanks filled in, and you have it signed by the buyer, that certificate will typically hold up through an audit, and even if it were to go beyond an audit.
Okay, one other question. This is a follow-up from Fernand. Would the monthly upload be considered one call or one call per invoice? This is related to cost to users of Avatar.
Very good question. And the way that we process it, and we have a fairly new asynchronous process that will allow you to push the transaction data in batch to our use tax assessment tool. It is through an upload, and then once the transactions are assessed, any that are assessed that I choose to assess the use tax and commit the transaction within Avatax, the usage will be based upon the total number of transactions that I have said I want to assess use tax and committed through the use tax tool. And if perhaps I got 500 invoices, of those 500 invoices, 100 are the ones that I am going to actually have use tax and have it assessed and have Avatax track that, it would be 100 transactions that would be added to my usage. So it's not an API call for the upload. It is the end result of what I ultimately process and commit within Avatax.
Great.
How was that, Stefan?
That was pretty clear.
Any others?
Nope, we're good for now.
All right. Well, we're right at 10:40. So talking about onboarding suppliers, we're talking about as the buyer onboarding a new supplier. I want to identify that this. I want to identify my buyer record. Is this an exempt purchase? Should I omit these? These are scenarios where you say the buyer may flag the supplier record. This is one way to put a setting on my invoices that when I process a particular invoice from a particular supplier, in the omit section, I will say, I know the supplier always charges me tax or should be charging me tax, and I don't want Avalara to assess that. That is a way to prevent a known and reputable and reliable supplier that's charging me tax correctly to omit that from the evaluation process, so that, again, and it gets back to usage, I'm reducing the usage because I'm saying I don't need these invoices processed by Avatax because I know I have a reliable supplier that's accurately charging me tax, or in many cases accurately exempting me.
Hey, Mark, I had a question come in via email. This is from Denise Munoz. Does Avatax connect to the marketplace exempt certificates, Amazon, Walmart, etc.? In our case, we could have a high volume of exempt certificates on the marketplace platforms.
Today, I am not aware of a connection between the marketplace exemption platform and Cert Capture. Though I'm going to ask Stefan to take some notes on that. We do have very good relationships with the different marketplaces, Amazon, Etsy, eBay, etc. In those scenarios, we have the ability to take marketplace data and do the compliance activities around reporting and filing for that. We do not have capabilities today to interact with its exemption platform, but that is certainly an area that we could look into, and an area for us to grow, because that is certainly an area that will sort of marry together not only the compliance piece of making sure I'm charging tax correctly and getting that filed and remitted when I have to charge tax through a marketplace, or on behalf of a marketplace or seller, but also then linking up with that exemption platform. So a long answer to say,
Growth area.
A growth area, no, we don't today. Any others?
Not
All right.
one.
So going back to where we were, onboarding new buyers, I'm interacting maybe with a procurement automation solution. When I talk about procurement automation solutions, some of the more popular ones that are out there, you've probably heard of Ariba, you've probably heard of Coupa. I'm not trying to single one out or exclude anyone, but those are the typical ones. You also see that many of them are SaaS platforms today. That's become quite the popular platform for these automation solutions. And many times these procurement automation solutions are creating a network between suppliers and buyers so that I can add on new suppliers or add on new buyers very easily because I'm all doing it through a consolidated platform. And so that the platform knows information about the supplier, it will also know information about the buyer. And in this scenario, if the buyer says, you know what, and the procurement platform has Avatax and Cert Capture embedded in it, then what I can do is, as the buyer, I can store my certificates and say, here's all my certificates for Ohio, for Nevada, for New York. And as I then add on a new supplier, or as a supplier adds on me, being able to interchange and have essentially clearinghouse for exemption certificates. But as I'm onboarding my new buyer on that procurement platform, I can leverage Cert Capture. I can leverage the platform if it's managing that through Cert Capture. Directly within the Cert Capture solution, and you'll see, and I'm going to go back out to my web page here. Over here, and many of you are probably already familiar with this, but this is developer.avalara.com. This is the repository and catalog of all Avalara APIs. Under the API section, you'll see that there are a variety of those. You'll see that here is API reference for the Avalara Avatax component. For Cert Capture, you'll see API references. The ones that I'm going to be talking about next are over here in the Cert Capture section for APIs. Going back to my PowerPoint, the key components for Cert Capture when I am, again, thinking of it from the supplier or seller's point of view, the way that I may be able to interact through API, interact from my procurement or my selling solution and interact directly with Cert Capture is through API calls. There are 4 primary calls that you'll see. One is call Cert Capture and indicate I am creating a new customer or new buyer. And that then records that customer and says, here's a customer, they're claiming an exemption, and I now have a record for that customer. And I might also record in there the various shipping addresses that I have for that buyer, because if I'm shipping to a particular address, especially if there might be multiple ship-tos in multiple states, I want to be able to track that. So first, I can create a new buyer or a new customer. I can then also go in through API and edit it as that changes, and perhaps my contact changes, or there is some additional information. I can interact as I update that within my selling solution. I can set it up so that it automatically updates Cert Capture with that new information. Also from that solution, I can request the exemption certificate saying, I've added this new buyer, and now please make a request for the exemption certificate and send that out. Once I've done that, Cert Capture will notify me once it comes back, and I can then go through whatever approval process I set up in Cert Capture. But also, I might not have direct access to Cert Capture. I might be on the selling team or the fulfillment team and saying, I'm not going to fulfill this until I have the certificate on file. Through an API request, I can call Cert Capture directly from my selling solution and check on the status of the exemption certificate. Have I received it? Is it an approved state? Maybe I haven't received it yet. So I can then do that without having to log into another application, check there, and then go back to my core application where I'm doing my selling. And then there can also be scenarios where I may just want to see it. I've checked the status, I see that I have a certificate on file, and I can call and retrieve and get the image of that certificate and have that available. Maybe I want to print it out, maybe I just want to take a look at it to make sure that it's accurate.
Hey Mark, we got a question from Fernand Pelayo again. Do you have code samples to create one new buyer, also known as customer, with multiple shipping to addresses?
And yes, we do. We have a variety of SDKs that we make available through the developer website. And so there should be sample code in our API method, as well as, if I get over there.
Is that on the Cert Capture or on the dev dot site?
It's on dev dot. And so if you go from dev dot, you'll see where there's a variety of SDKs. But there is sample code available in there. And I'm not 100%, but fairly sure that I've got SDK examples over in Cert Capture as well.
Which SDK would it be? I just want to Slack. I want to send the link to you.
What we can do is let's take that as a follow-up.
Sure.
And I'll get you
Okay.
the correct links.
Great, thanks.
I also wanted to just be mindful of time. We're just about 10 minutes before the top of the hour. And I don't have much more in here. I think a lot of it's just going to be reiterating what I've already talked about. Consumer use tax, I may want a validation process. I may want that validation process to be dynamic, because as I'm processing an invoice from a supplier, I want to be able to validate the sales tax that was charged, potentially undercharge, or if I'm undercharged or not charged when I should be able to do that dynamically. Can also do that asynchronously, depending on, again, what my business process flow is and what my real compelling reason for being able to, needing to evaluate use tax. Key items are going to be the type of document. When you're calling in AvaTax to call for a use tax assessment, you're going to use the exact same API that you used whenever you were calling us for sales tax. And I'm going to go over to my API references. The place where you would see that is under transactions, and the most common is create transaction. Create transaction, the way that it's going to determine what type am I dealing with, a use tax scenario versus a sales tax scenario, is what we call document type. And that is a parameter or a data element within the API call. Document type, you're going to see a variety of them, but there could be, if it is a sales order or a sales invoice, that is going to trigger a sales or seller use tax calculation, typically a sales tax calculation. When the AvaTax service sees a document type of purchase order, purchase invoice, could also be a inventory transfer order or inventory transfer invoice, a slightly different scenario, not in the purchasing, but in inventory movement. If the document types are one of those four, most importantly, purchase order or purchase invoice, it is going to trigger a consumer use tax calculation. I'm going to accrue tax. The key component here is this is an accrual. If I am undercharged or not charged tax when I should have been paying tax, when I accrue that, I want to put that in a liability, maybe an open use tax liability account within my general ledger. The key element for this is do not send that money to the supplier. The supplier has no way to remit that back to the taxing authority. This is money that you are going to retain and then remit and file and remit to the taxing authority through your normal tax return process. And the other key component in dealing with consumer use tax is the general ledger account assignment. When I'm a seller and I'm assessing sales tax, I am expecting to have the buyer pay me that sales tax, and I'm putting that as a liability, and I want to record that tax is a liability that I'm going to, when I get that funded through the customer, I'm going to send that on and pass that through to the taxing authority. In a use tax scenario, if I am making a purchase of monitors, or I'll give you a better example, I'm purchasing $10,000 worth of fixed assets, maybe $10,000 worth of desks because I've opened a new office. I should have been charged a 10% tax rate on that. I was not charged tax. I have $1,000 that is due. That $1,000, I want to assign the GL account for that $1,000 of use tax that I'm self-assessing. I typically want to assign that to my fixed asset amount for wherever I'm putting that general ledger account for those desks. The reason being is that most accountants consider the tax as part of the total cost of ownership of those desks, and I want to show that my asset is actually worth $11,000, not $10,000 plus $10,000 or $1,000 sales tax expense. So there is a different mindset as I'm going through and building the use tax integration. If you're comfortable with building sales tax, there are a couple nuances: document type, accrual generation, making sure I'm not sending that money back to the supplier, and most importantly, getting that use tax categorized in the appropriate, debited to the appropriate GL account.
Okay, we have a question, another question from Fernand. You mentioned earlier we can create on the fly exemption certificates. Did you mean that I can create an exemption certificate on the fly and you are filing for me with the tax authority? This would explain needing to check the status later on.
What I was talking about is generating them on the fly and through the use of the Cert Express tool. All the Cert Express tool is doing, and it is a great tool, but what it is doing is, as a buyer, it is allowing me to come in here, put in information about who I am, my company's name, my ID, and it is allowing an electronic generation of sourcing of that. And it's going to also ask you questions on what is the reason for the exemption. And the value add in Cert Express is, once I've identified where I'm consuming the product or where I'm located, the reason why I'm claiming the exemption, our Cert Express solution will identify the appropriate form for you and then walk you through the pieces that need to be filled out so I have a compliant form, allow me to electronically sign that, and then forward that on to my seller. It is not necessarily, most states do not keep on file your exemption certificate that you've handed out. What they're doing in like the state of Ohio is, in fact, back in the day, this might show my age a little bit, but back in the day, the way that you would get an exemption certificate to file for the state of Ohio as the buyer handing it off to a seller is, I would either have to go online and order the form and have it sent to me, or go down to the local Ohio State tax office and go in, and they had a ream of paper that were printed out forms that I'd pull off, take with me, and then fill out manually. So this Cert Express solution is basically allowing you to not retain that or send that off to the taxing authority, but sending it off to your supplier so that they have your certificate on file. I will add a caveat in there. There are, I believe, 2 states that I know Maine issues a certificate on behalf of the buyer, and the buyer then forwards that on to the seller. Florida has a similar one. The state of Washington has it for certain types of businesses like contractors. They have a special process they have to go through. But for the most part, most states are, as the buyer, as long as I'm completing the form and putting in the accurate information, and I am honestly claiming an exemption, that is legitimate for the supplier. Ultimately, the buyer may be asked to validate that. The state may come to them and say, prove to me that you're incorporating this in your manufacturing process, or prove to me that you're reselling these items. But that is the validation that the buyer would have to give.
Okay, and I know we're at time, but Scott McDonald has surfaced a URL to a upload certificate API, and it says, seems to let you upload certs via Avatax API. I am assuming this requires us to add Cert Capture to our account for this to work.
Precisely. But that is the method that you could document that or perform that action.
Okay. Good. I think that's it. All right, folks, we are at time. Mark, thank you so much for putting the deck together and walking everyone through this important stuff. Let's see. Scott said thanks and great webinar. Thank you, Scott. Thanks to everyone for attending. One final note, I have uploaded the deck that Mark presented to the handout section. So you can have that for reference. You can download it, and I think that is it. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of the week. And we will not have a developer webinar in August, but we will have developer webinars in September, October, November, and December. You can also, you know what? I will put the link to the webinar hub, so that everyone can see it.
It's over in...
It's on Avalara.com. I'm putting this into the chat box, guys. This is the URL to our webinar homepage, and that is where you can sign up for upcoming webinars. We also have lots of webinars that are on demand. You simply just click watch now and you'll get a YouTube video, and we will upload this one in the next week or so to the page. So thank you everyone again, and have a great week.
And a great summer.
Yes. Okay.